London, December 23, 2025. In the early hours of the morning, Buckingham Palace confirmed what senior aides described as a necessary and irreversible clarification of boundaries, and it landed with unmistakable force. The confirmation followed a rare, sharply worded statement personally authorised by Prince William, responding directly to a series of public attacks launched by Prince Harry against both King Charles III and Catherine. Attacks that palace insiders say could no longer be ignored without consequence. The palace statement did not name Meghan Markle directly in its opening paragraph, and that omission was intentional. Instead, the issue was framed as institutional protection, not a family grievance, but the message was crystal clear. The era of tolerating public assaults on the monarchy, especially those amplified through commercial media platforms and profit-driven narratives, was officially over, and the gloves were off in a controlled but unmistakable way. There comes a point, the statement read, when silence ceases to be restraint and becomes abdication, and that point has now passed. This marked the first time in years that William had approved language with such clarity and finality. He had deliberately kept his distance from the Sussex media cycle, refusing to engage publicly even when narratives questioned his leadership, challenged the moral authority of the crown, or dragged his wife into speculative framing. That restraint ended abruptly after Harry's most recent remarks, where he accused King Charles of emotional neglect, alleged institutional cruelty toward Meghan, and directly criticised Catherine for failing to step in publicly during the 2021 controversy surrounding Meghan's integration into royal life. For palace officials, that accusation crossed from opinion into accusation, and the tone alone changed everything. According to palace sources, the decision to respond was not emotional, but procedural, and that distinction matters. While Harry's December comments provided the immediate spark, insiders stress the response had been quietly prepared well in advance, dating back to 2021. The palace had been tracking the cumulative effect of repeated Sussex-linked media projects, including television series, interviews, podcasts, and affiliated commentary that steadily reframed private family dynamics as systemic moral failures of the monarchy. Initially, these appearances were tolerated. Palace advisors believed public interest would cool and that restraint would protect long-term institutional credibility. But over time, the tone hardened and the messaging escalated in ways that insiders say could no longer be dismissed as personal reflection or emotional processing. What began as anecdotal storytelling about royal life gradually evolved into claims of structural victimization, accompanied by accusations of racial bias and deeply personal allegations involving senior working royals who were bound by convention not to respond. Harry's latest intervention crossed a decisive threshold by publicly portraying Catherine as complicit, or worse, calculating, in Meghan's alleged mistreatment, shifting the dispute from narrative disagreement into direct reputational harm. That, aides say, is what forced William's hand. His response was deliberately structured in 3 clear parts, each designed to close doors rather than invite debate. First, it reaffirmed the palace's position on 2021, stating that internal concerns raised at the time were addressed through established channels, and that no senior royal acted with malice or prejudice, a point insiders insisted be placed firmly on record. Without naming Meghan, the statement rejected the idea that public silence equaled moral failure. Second, it addressed Harry directly, though again without using his name, asserting that private family disagreements had been repeatedly transformed into public accusations for commercial amplification. The phrase, instrumentalization of grievance, appeared once, carefully placed, and insiders say that wording was chosen with legal and reputational precision. Third, and most consequentially, William drew a hard boundary. No individual, regardless of title by marriage or birth, would be permitted to monetize association with the crown while simultaneously undermining its legitimacy. Sources confirm that line was coordinated with King Charles and senior constitutional advisors, making it policy, not rhetoric. The king did not issue a separate statement. and palace officials say that was deliberate. Charles remains personally wounded by Harry's language, but he is determined to avoid public escalation. His role was to authorize William's authority to speak as future monarch and guardian of institutional continuity, reinforcing that this was a generational handoff moment as much as a response. Privately, aides confirmed that the king agreed the line had to be drawn, not against his son personally, but against a pattern of conduct that risked normalizing public attacks on the monarchy as entertainment content. Notably, Catherine made no comment, issued no background briefing, and offered no anonymous rebuttal, and according to those close to her, that silence was intentional and disciplined. Catherine's position has remained unchanged since 2021. The monarchy does not defend itself through personal counter-narratives. Her refusal to engage is not avoidance, it is doctrine. She will not trade dignity for temporary vindication, and, as one senior aide put it, she will not allow the institution to be dragged into a personality contest, no matter how loud the pressure gets. Silence, however, should not be mistaken for passivity. Palace records confirm that Catherine has been deeply involved in internal reviews of staff welfare, media protocol, and boundaries between private life and public duty. Since the Sussex departure, her influence has been administrative rather than performative, shaping policy quietly rather than chasing headlines. By the end of December 23, the palace had achieved exactly what it intended: clarity. There would be no rolling rebuttals, no tit-for-tat interviews, and no public sparring. William had spoken once, firmly, and the institution would move forward on that basis. Whether Harry accepts that boundary remains uncertain, but one fact is now beyond dispute. The future king has chosen to defend both his family and the crown. Even if that decision cements a permanent fracture behind carefully worded public language, palace officials see a more complex dynamic shaping Prince Harry's alignment with Meghan Markle, one driven as much by commercial logic as by personal conviction. That distinction matters because it explains why Prince William no longer views the conflict as a family dispute, but as an institutional challenge that required a formal response. When Harry and Meghan stepped back from royal duties in 2020, the palace expected a finite adjustment period. What followed instead was an expanding media ecosystem built around royal proximity. Early content framed the departure as liberating. Later productions recast it as survival, and by 2021, the narrative shifted decisively toward grievance, pain, exclusion, and moral injury delivered at global scale. Internal assessments noted a clear pattern. Releases were timed for maximum global impact. Allegations escalated when public interest dipped. Personal memories were reframed as structural indictments. Advisors concluded the objective was not reconciliation, but relevance, and this is where Harry's vulnerability became leverage rather than healing. Harry's long-documented sensitivity to childhood scrutiny, including persistent speculation about his appearance and humiliating demands for proof during his youth, was reintroduced publicly as evidence of lifelong marginalization. Meghan framed this as shared trauma, a bond forged through mutual misunderstanding and perceived exile within the palace. The internal interpretation was harsher. Senior aides argue that Harry's pain was real, but selectively curated. What was omitted, they note, was King Charles III's sustained effort to compensate through protection, inclusion, and private support well into Harry's adulthood. By reframing those experiences as institutional cruelty, the Sussex narrative converted personal history into marketable content. For William, this crossed a moral line. Unlike Meghan, Harry does not come from the entertainment industry and does not instinctively operate by its rules. Insiders say he underestimated the pressure imposed by major platforms like Netflix, where visibility depends on escalation, because calm reflection does not trend. Controversy does. From 2021 onward, several Sussex-linked ventures underperformed or faced monetization limits, yet the association with the royal brand kept attention alive. Standing near the crown's shadow proved almost as valuable as direct access itself. William's concern wasn't only reputational damage, it was precedent-setting risk. If grievance could be endlessly monetized without consequence, silence would become complicity. Harry's public criticism of Catherine struck palace officials as both unfair and strategically revealing. Catherine had followed protocol in 2021 by refusing to litigate personal matters through the press, a decision now reframed by Harry as moral failure, but seen internally as institutional loyalty. Those close to William say that accusation was decisive. Catherine had absorbed years of comparison, insinuation, and narrative pressure without response. Portraying her as calculating while elevating Meghan as the injured party was, in William's view, a distortion that demanded correction, and that calculation was not sentimental, but structural. A monarchy cannot coexist with a parallel commercial narrative that profits from depicting it as abusive. One system depends on continuity and trust, the other on disruption and attention, and they are fundamentally incompatible. By responding now, William moved to end ambiguity, making clear that Harry's choice to publicly align with Meghan against the crown carries consequences. Not emotional retaliation, but structural separation. The palace does not seek Harry's humiliation, it seeks insulation. In the days leading up to the statement authorised by Prince William, Buckingham Palace was not in crisis mode. It was in review mode, and what unfolded behind closed doors was a methodical assessment. Legal, constitutional, and reputational frameworks were applied to answer one question: at what point does restraint stop serving the crown? Contrary to speculation, William did not act unilaterally. Senior constitutional advisers, private secretaries from Clarence House and Kensington Palace, and legal counsel specialising in reputational risk met repeatedly between December 16th and December 21st. The brief was narrow and disciplined: determine whether recent public statements constituted routine criticism or a sustained attempt to delegitimise the monarchy for commercial gain. The conclusion was unanimous. The pattern had hardened, and by framing personal grievances as systemic injustice and naming senior working royals, specifically Catherine, as morally culpable, the Sussex narrative crossed from commentary into damage, where silence could no longer hold. Advisers warned that William's actions would not be read as dignity, but as acquiescence, a risk everyone understood. King Charles III stayed publicly silent, but behind closed doors, his position was crystal clear. According to aides present at Clarence House, the king outlined 3 uncompromising red lines. First, he would not allow the crown to be portrayed as racially or institutionally abusive without solid evidence, formal rebuttal, or measurable consequences. Such allegations, he stressed, strike directly at the legitimacy of the constitutional monarchy itself. Second, no senior working royal, and particularly the Princess of Wales, would be left vulnerable to character assassination. Under the guise of personal testimony, Charles viewed Catherine's conduct since 2021 as exemplary, not evasive, and she had consistently adhered to protocol under intense scrutiny. Third, the monarchy would no longer tolerate the ongoing commercialization of royal proximity, while simultaneously absorbing reputational damage without accountability. The king argued this was no longer acceptable. These red lines did not demand retaliation. They demanded clarity, discipline, and a firm structural response. Catherine's role in these deliberations was quiet but decisive, shaping the strategy without ever stepping into public view. Since the Sussex departure, Catherine has consistently rejected both direct and indirect offers from media entities seeking exclusives, commentary, or contextual balance. Several such approaches intensified after Meghan's Netflix appearances, gaining more traction each time Catherine declined. Her reasoning, aides say, is simple and uncompromising. Once a working royal monetizes narrative, the institution becomes content, and content by definition must escalate to survive. That logic, Catherine believes, is incompatible with the monarchy, and it now forms the backbone of what officials refer to as the palace's post-2021 media doctrine. The crown does not compete in the attention economy, it outlasts it. William has fully embraced this doctrine. His December statement was therefore not a rebuttal in the entertainment sense, it was boundary setting with precision. Timing was critical. By late December 2025, palace polling indicated a troubling normalization. A segment of the public had begun to accept that royal legitimacy could be measured by personal testimony rather than constitutional function. Advisers warned that this shift could not be allowed to calcify, and William's intervention sought to reverse that drift. Not by disputing every claim, but by reframing the entire dispute. This was no longer about feelings, it was about function and institutional authority. None of this was undertaken lightly. William was clear-eyed about the personal cost. Speaking now would harden the divide with his brother, he knew, but continued silence would erode the authority he is expected to inherit. As one senior aide put it bluntly, he chose the crown knowing it might cost him Harry. That is not cruelty, it is duty. By the evening of December 23rd, the internal consensus had crystallized. The palace would speak once, firmly, and then disengage. No rolling commentary, no escalation. The line had been drawn, not in anger, but in ink. If Prince William's statement was designed to end ambiguity, the hours that followed proved just how precisely it had been calibrated. By mid-afternoon, the palace had already anticipated the next phase: reaction, reframing, and retaliation, primarily from California. Sources close to Prince Harry describe his response as conflicted, rather than explosive. Publicly, there was no statement. Privately, aides say Harry interpreted William's words not as an institutional clarification, but as a personal rejection, one that appeared final and unmovable. Within hours, Harry contacted intermediaries seeking reassurance that the palace statement was not a prelude to further action. The response he received was measured and consistent. No additional commentary, no clarifications, no engagement. The line drawn that morning would be the line that stood for Harry. This was destabilizing. The absence of counter-dialogue removed the very public arena, back-and-forth media space, on which his interventions had previously relied. By contrast, Meghan's team moved quickly to shape narratives in the US, briefing outlets with a careful emphasis on hurt, disbelief, and moral disappointment. The language was measured. No direct attacks on William, no fresh allegations. Instead, Meghan was positioned as the aggrieved party confronting an unyielding institution. This restraint was tactical. Advisers knew that escalation could only validate the palace's core argument. Grievance had been repeatedly instrumentalized for attention. Behind the scenes, however, options were assessed. A renewed podcast cycle, a limited interview, a reflective essay, all were tested against one constraint: viability. Since 2021, multiple Sussex-linked projects had faced monetization hurdles. Platforms demanded either novelty or intensity, neither of which could be supplied without reigniting controversy. The conclusion was uncomfortable but clear. Immediate retaliation would likely underperform. The palace's choice to disengage was not passive, it was defensive architecture. Communications teams had prepared scenario briefs weeks in advance, mapping likely lines of attack and the corresponding response, which in nearly every scenario was none. This strategy was shaped in large part by Catherine's long-standing principle: once a royal responds to a personal narrative, they validate it as a legitimate forum. Silence, paired with visible duty, shifts the burden of proof back onto the accuser. Accordingly, Catherine's schedule on December 23rd and 24th proceeded unchanged. Charitable engagements, staff meetings, holiday preparations, all went on as normal. Images released that evening projected calm, continuity, and control, not reaction. King Charles III remained resolutely above the fray, briefed continuously, issuing no public comment, authorizing no leaks. Advisers described his posture as containment, focused entirely on protecting the institution rather than participating in spectacle. The objective was to prevent the dispute from metastasizing into a constitutional distraction during a sensitive period. Privately, however, the king supported William's firmness, seeing the statement as necessary insulation, protecting the crown from being recast as a perpetual defendant in an endless media trial, a factor weighing heavily in palace calculations. Audience fatigue analyses indicated diminishing returns on Sussex-centred controversy. While attention spikes remained possible, sustained influence had waned. Repetition dulled impact. This reality constrained Meghan's options. Escalation risked backlash. Silence risked irrelevance. By contrast, the palace's silence carried no such downside. By the end of December 24th, what many had predicted, a public clash, had not materialized. No dramatic rebuttal, no tit-for-tat interview cycle. The counter-offensive, carefully prepared, never landed. William's calculation proved correct. By speaking once clearly and then withdrawing, the palace denied critics the oxygen required for a sustained confrontation. The message to allies and adversaries alike was unmistakable. The Crown would not chase narrative. It would set terms. What followed Prince William's December 23rd statement was not a media battle, but a recalibration within palace walls, a methodical assertion of authority that left no room for ambiguity, and established once and for all that the monarchy controls the conversation on its own terms. Aides began calling this moment the end of elasticity. For the first time since the Sussex departure, the monarchy had defined, not negotiated, the terms of engagement. William's decision marks a structural shift in royal authority. Past crises were absorbed through accommodation and silence, often stretching convention to absorb pressure. This time, authority was asserted through limitation. One statement, no follow-ups, no counter-narratives. Constitutional advisors see this as precedent-setting. A monarchy that refuses to litigate itself publicly does not look weak. It looks governed. The message is clear. Legitimacy flows from continuity and conduct, not from winning arguments. For Prince Harry, the consequences are stark. William's boundary does not sever blood ties, but it narrows institutional access. The palace has signalled that any future interaction, if it occurs, will happen privately and without amplification. This places Harry in a narrow corridor. Public alignment with Meghan's media strategy risks deeper estrangement, while retreat from it risks alienating his partner. Either path carries cost. Advisors stress that reconciliation is not impossible, but it is conditional. The rule is simple: disengage from the commercialization of grievance. Until then, the palace will not re-enter dialogue. If William's role is to draw lines, Catherine's role has been to hold the centre since 2021. She has become the monarchy's moral ballast, not through proclamation, but through refusal. Refusal to monetize access, refusal to rebut personal attacks, refusal to convert duty into content. These refusals have accrued power internally. Catherine is now consulted on matters far beyond patronages, staff, welfare, media ethics, and the psychological costs of public service. Her influence is procedural, shaping how decisions are made rather than how they're announced. As one senior aide put it, she doesn't win arguments, she removes the need for them. For King Charles III, William's stance resolves a tension that had lingered since 2020. The king has long believed in compassion and dialogue, but he also understands institutional fragility. Privately, he sees William's action as necessary, a hardening adaptation to a harsher media ecosystem. His support is quiet but firm, delegating operational authority to William on this front, signalling trust in his heir's judgment. That delegation is consequential, marking a subtle transition in leadership style even before succession. Perhaps the most significant outcome is closure. For 5 years, the Sussex arrangement existed in a grey zone, royal by association, independent by operation, critical by narrative. That ambiguity has now ended. The palace made clear, royal status cannot be selectively invoked. You cannot reject the institution while trading on its symbolism. You cannot claim privacy while selling proximity. These contradictions, long tolerated, are no longer absorbed. This does not make the monarchy colder. It makes it clearer. William's intervention signals a future crown that is less sentimental, but more stable, prioritizing survival over emotional appeasement. Catherine's influence ensures this firmness is tempered by empathy, not spectacle. Together, they represent a generational recalibration, dignity over drama, duty over display. The cost is real: a brother lost, a family fracture hardened. From William's perspective, allowing the monarchy to be continuously reframed as an antagonist in someone else's story was untenable. By the evening of December 23rd, the immediate noise had settled. What remained was not outrage, but reassessment across Britain and increasingly abroad. The question shifted from what was said to what had been defined. By drawing a boundary, William forced a recalibration, not only of family expectations, but of how a modern monarchy asserts legitimacy in an era of permanent exposure. Early polling snapshots showed predictably divided reactions. A vocal segment hailed William's firmness as overdue responsibility. Another segment viewed it as coldness, arguing compassion should have tempered authority. Yet analysts noted something surprising. No drift, opinions polarized but stabilized. The monarchy did not hemorrhage support, it consolidated it. Consolidation matters more than transient applause. Volatility is the real threat, not disagreement. William's single, firm intervention replaced a fluid, chaotic narrative with a fixed reference point. The public could now agree or disagree with a line, rather than chase an evolving dispute. Internationally, the effect was pronounced. Commonwealth observers and diplomatic partners interpreted the move not as a family rebuke, but as governance, a monarchy unwilling to monetize itself, unwilling to perform for platforms, projects predictability. Predictability sustains soft power. This explains why the palace resisted pressure to clarify or humanize the message for global audiences. Humanization invites endless interpretation. Finality commands respect. The future remains unresolved, but newly constrained. The palace has not closed the door to reconciliation. It has relocated it. Any path back runs through private conduct, not public persuasion. That condition reframes Harry's options. Align with commercial storytelling depicting the crown as antagonist. Separation deepens by default. Disengage. Space for repair opens. Quiet, untelevised, intact. King Charles III emerges from this moment having authorized William's authority while withholding his own voice. He achieved two objectives: preserved the dignity of the crown and affirmed operational leadership of his heir. This calibrated restraint signals continuity rather than retreat. Aides describe alignment absent since 2020. The institution is no longer split between accommodation and defence. It has chosen a definition. If this episode has a moral axis, it is Catherine. Her consistent refusal to monetize proximity, her disciplined silence under pressure, her visible commitment to duty, has quietly reshaped expectations of royal conduct. She has not argued against the attention economy, she has declined to enter it. That refusal has proven contagious. Internal protocols now reflect heightened sensitivity to staff welfare, media boundaries, and the psychological costs of exposure. Catherine's influence has converted restraint into policy. History will likely mark this as the moment the Sussex exception closed definitively. Ambiguity persisted. Royal symbolism was leveraged without accountability. Now resolved, the palace asserts a principle that cannot be selectively applied. Association without allegiance is corrosive. The message is not punitive, it is preventive. Was this a rupture? Undeniably, a family fracture has hardened and the cost is human. But institutions endure by choosing renewal over appeasement. Renewal does not require noise. It requires limits. William's decision, supported by Charles and steady under Catherine's influence, signals a monarchy adapting to survive the next era, less elastic, more legible, less performative, more governed. In that sense, the 23rd of December, 2025 will be remembered not for what the palace said, but for what it refused to become. A participant in its own commodification. The crown has drawn a line, and in doing so, it has quietly begun to rebuild. Comment below what you think about William's move. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story with anyone following the royal saga.